The president of my homeowners association stood up at the monthly meeting, smiling, and moved to put a lien on my house over a garden. I want you to start here in a fluorescent lit clubhouse room with folding chairs and bad coffee. Because nobody expects a war to happen in a place this boring. About 40 of my neighbors were there. The board sat at a long table at the front, and Carol Voss, the president, stood at the center of it in her blazer with her gavel and her binder, in the full bloom of her authority, ready to make an example of me. She'd been building to this for 3 months, the violation notices, the fines, $50 a day, stacking, the letters with the threatening language. She was certain that tonight she'd finish it, that she'd either get her lien or finally watch the quiet woman from the little house at the end of the street stand up and beg. Either way, Carol would win in front of everyone, the way Carol liked to win. She read the motion out loud. A lien against my property for unpaid fines, she asked with a small satisfied smile. Whether the homeowner, me, had anything to say before the board voted? I did, as it happened. I stood up, and I picked up the binder that had been sitting in my lap the whole meeting, the one Carol had been glancing at all night, without quite letting herself wonder about it. A thick one, tabbed, 3 months of quiet work. I told the board I had no objection to the rules being enforced, none at all. In fact, I wanted to thank Carol for caring so much about enforcing them. Because I'd brought the association's own records, the ones I'd legally requested, and they'd legally had to give me, I thought, since we were all here, that we should finally enforce the rules on everyone, equally. By the book. And then I opened the binder to the tab I'd marked for Carol's own house. To understand why a tabbed binder could end a 3-month war in about 10 minutes. Why the quiet new neighbor was the most dangerous person in that boring little room. I have to take you back to the day I moved in. Stay with me. My name is Dana. I'm 34 years old, and the little house at the end of the street was the first thing in my life that was entirely, only, mine. Let me tell you what it meant, because the garden matters to this story. And you can't understand why Carol's campaign cut so deep without understanding what she was actually cutting at. I'd had a hard few years, Clem. I won't lay all of it. The short version is that a long relationship ended, and a chapter of my life closed that I'd thought was permanent, and I came out the other side with not much except a steady job and a stubborn determination to build something stable on my own. So I did the most grown-up, terrifying thing I'd ever done. I bought a house, a small one, nothing fancy, at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a tidy little subdivision. With my own name on the deed, my own savings in the down payment, and nobody beside me to share the weight or the credit. And in the backyard that first spring, I built a garden. I need you to understand that the garden wasn't landscaping to me. It was therapy with dirt under its fingernails. Every weekend that first year, I was out there, raised beds, a little gravel path, tomatoes and herbs, and a riot of flowers I'd researched obsessively. It was the first thing in years that was just mine, that I'd made with my own hands, that asked nothing of me except patience, and gave back something every single day. I'd have coffee out there in the mornings, and feel, for the first time in a long time, like the ground under me was solid. I should also tell you what I do for a living, because it turns out to matter. I'm not a lawyer. I'm something quieter, and, for Carol's purposes, much worse. I spent years working in compliance and audit. My entire professional life has been about reading the boring documents nobody else reads. The bylaws, the records, the ledgers, fine print. And finding the one place where what an organization says it does and what it actually does don't match. I am very, very good at it. It is, honestly, a slightly tedious superpower. Carol Voss looked at the quiet woman in the little house with the pretty garden and saw an easy target. She had no way of knowing. She'd just picked a fight with someone whose whole career was reading the exact kind of documents she'd spent years assuming no one ever would. Let me tell you about Carol, because the whole story turns on exactly the kind of power she had and exactly how she used it. Carol Voss had been president of our Homeowners Association for a long time, long enough that the role had stopped being a volunteer position and become, somewhere along the way, a small kingdom. She ran the board, she ran the meetings, she ran, as far as anyone could tell, the entire neighborhood through a combination of bylaws she quoted selectively, and a willingness to make life miserable for anyone who crossed her that most people simply weren't willing to test. And Carol enforced the rules. Oh, she enforced the rules. But, and this is the whole thing, she enforced them like weather. They fell on some houses and not others. Her friends could leave a boat in the driveway for a month. The family who'd once backed her at a meeting could let their lawn go brown all summer. But let someone get on Carol's wrong side. Suddenly, the rulebook came out, thick and merciless. For a mailbox an inch too tall or a trash can left out an hour too long. I got on Carol's wrong side almost immediately, and I'm honestly still not sure how. Maybe it was that I was new and single and didn't come to her with the little tribute of deference she expected. Maybe it was just that my garden was getting attention. Neighbors stopping to admire it, which meant attention not flowing to Carol. Whatever it was, 3 weeks after I moved in, the first letter arrived. It was about the garden. My raised beds, the notice informed me, violated a provision about approved landscaping. My flowers were the wrong kind of plant in the wrong kind of bed. I needed to remove them, restore the yard to community standards, to submit any future changes to the architectural committee, which was, of course, Carol. I was baffled. 3 other houses on my street had vegetable gardens. One had a raised bed identical to mine. Mention this politely in my reply. That was my mistake. Carol did not like to be shown an inconsistency. And from that moment, the letter became a campaign. The campaign escalated the way these things do, slowly. Then, all at once, when I didn't tear out my garden, the fines started. $50 a day, the notice said, for the continuing violation. $50 a day, accruing, on a garden that was identical to 3 others on the street that never got a single letter. I appealed in writing, by the book, calm and documented. Carol's board, which was really just Carol, and a few people who'd learned it was easier to agree with her, denied the appeal without explanation. Then came more letters. My trash cans were now visible for an impermissible duration. My porch light was the wrong temperature of bulb. A wind chime was an unapproved exterior fixture. Each one carried its own fine. Carol had clearly gone looking, walking my property line with a clipboard, and she'd found that if you look hard enough at anyone's house, you can always find something. The fines stacked. 50 here, claim. 25 there, the garden's 50 a day, churning underneath all of it. And then, the letter that was meant to break me. Once the unpaid fines crossed a threshold, the notice explained the association could place a lien on my home, and an HOA lien, if it goes far enough, can lead to foreclosure. They could, in theory, take my house. The first thing that had ever been only mine. Over a garden. I want to tell you how that felt, sitting at my own kitchen table, reading that letter, because it's the low point of this story, and it's where it almost went a different way. I felt the panic of it, the unfairness, the specific helplessness of being targeted by someone with a rulebook and a grudge, and more stamina for cruelty than you have for fighting. For a couple of days, I genuinely thought about just tearing out the garden, paying the fines, making myself smaller, until Carol got bored and found someone else. And then, on the 3rd night, the auditor in me woke up, because I realized I'd been thinking about it all wrong. I'd been trying to defend myself against the rules. And the rules weren't actually the problem. Carol's selective use of them was. which meant the rules weren't her weapon. They were about to be mine. Here is the thing Carol counted on, the thing every small tyrant counts on, that no one ever reads the documents. But homeowners have rights, and in our state, in most states, those rights include access to the association's records, the governing documents, the meeting minutes, the enforcement history, and crucially, the financials. An HOA is not Carol's personal kingdom, however much she ran it like one. It's a corporation with books, and the members are legally entitled to look at them. So I sent a formal written request, polite and specific, citing the exact statute. I asked for the full governing documents, the architectural guidelines, the complete enforcement and violation records for the entire community going back several years, the board meeting, minutes, and the association's financial records, including contracts and reserve account statements. Carol's office was legally required to produce them. I think she assumed I'd never actually read them, that the request was a bluff, the flailing of a cornered homeowner. She had them sent over in a fat, disorganized stack, probably hoping the sheer boredom of it would defeat me. She forgot what I do for a living. I spent 3 weeks with that stack at my kitchen table, after work, doing the thing I have done my entire career, reading the boring documents nobody reads, and finding the places where what the organization said it did and what it actually did didn't match. What I found was a masterpiece, in its way. First, the enforcement records proved exactly what I already suspected. The rules were enforced almost entirely against a handful of homeowners. Carol disliked all identical violations elsewhere, including by board members and Carol's friends, went unaddressed for years. My garden had generated more violation notices in 3 months than entire streets had in 3 years. Second, and better, Carol's own house. The architectural guidelines she'd thrown at me were a glass house, and she lived in it. Carol had a large sunroom addition on the back of her home that had never gone through the architectural committee she chaired. No application, no approval, nothing in the file. Her fence sat well over the setback line the bylaws required. Her own property was a quiet catalog of exactly the kind of violations she'd been fining me into the ground for. And third, the real one, the financials. For 3 years, the association's landscaping contract. A significant chunk of every homeowner's dues had been awarded without competitive bids to a company owned by Carol's brother-in-law. The reserve fund, the money meant to protect all of us, had line items that didn't add up, payments that didn't match approvals, a softness in the numbers that, to a trained eye, looked less like sloppiness and more like a hand in the till. I sat back from my kitchen table at 1 a.m, surrounded by paper, and I felt the strange, quiet calm I always feel at the end of an audit. When the picture finally resolves, Carol had spent 3 months trying to take my house for breaking the rules. She had no idea how many of them she'd broken herself. Here is what I did with what I'd found, and not one piece of it was loud. I didn't post it on the neighborhood forum. I didn't send Carol a triumphant email. I didn't call a lawyer and threaten to sue, though I now easily could have. Loud would have made me the angry new neighbor with a vendetta, and it would have given Carol the one thing she was good at. A fight to spin, a villain to point at, a reason to rally her little board around her. I wasn't going to hand her a war. I was going to hand her a meeting. So I did the quiet, procedural, devastating thing. I followed the rules, all of them. I formally requested, in writing and citing the bylaws, that several items be added to the agenda of the next open board meeting, the kind of meeting any homeowner can attend, where the board has to conduct business in front of the community. Claim. I requested a review of the association's enforcement consistency, a review of unaddressed architectural violations, neighborhood-wide, and a review of the landscaping contract and the reserve account with supporting documentation. I worded every request blandly. No accusations. Just a member of the community, respectfully asking the board to ensure the rules were being applied fairly and the finances managed properly. Carol couldn't refuse to put them on the agenda without violating the very bylaws she lived to quote. The trap was that there was no trap, only the rules, finally pointed in every direction at once. And I built my binder, calm, tabbed, sourced entirely from the association's own records. Nothing I dug up, nothing private, nothing but what Carol's own office had been legally required to hand me. A tab for the selective enforcement claim, a tab for the architectural violations with a section for Carol's unpermitted sunroom and her over-the-line fence, and a tab for the contract and the reserve fund. There was a clock running too. The lien on my house was moving forward on Carol's timeline, scheduled to be voted at that very meeting. She thought the meeting was where she'd finish me. I let her keep thinking that. I RSVP'd to the meeting. I made copies, and I sat down in a folding chair with my binder in my lap, and I waited for Carol Voss to stand up and move to take my house. So now you know what was in the binder. Let me take you back into that fluorescent lit room. It went, at first, exactly the way Carol planned. That's the part I want you to feel, because it's where the tension lives. For the first stretch of that meeting, I genuinely looked like I was about to lose. Carol ran the room with the easy command of someone who'd never been challenged in it. She read her motion, she laid out my fines, my repeated violations, my refusal to comply. She painted me, calmly and effectively, as a difficult new neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to her. I watched a few of my neighbors nod along, because Carol was good at this, and the story she told was tidy. And nobody in that room yet had any reason to doubt her. She asked if I had anything to say before the vote, and I could hear in her voice that she expected me to either stay silent or come apart. The cornered homeowner, finally cornered. For 1 second, the old instinct rose. To keep my head down, pay the fines, make myself smaller. It's a powerful pull, the pull to not make trouble. I set it down, and I stood up with my binder, and I thanked her. I said I agreed completely that the rules mattered and that they should be enforced. I said I'd been so impressed by the board's commitment to enforcement that I'd taken the time to review the association's own records, which, I noted gently, every homeowner has the legal right to do, so that we could make sure the rules were being applied fairly to everyone. And since we were all here, I said, maybe we could start. Then I opened the binder, and I did the thing Carol never imagined the quiet woman would do. I read from her own records, calmly, tab by tab. I started with the enforcement log, not accusing anyone, just reading the numbers. How many violation notices had gone to my address in 3 months? How many had gone to 3 other streets with visible, identical violations in 3 years? I let the contrast just sit there in the air, sourced and undeniable, until the room went quiet in a new way. Then I turned to the architectural violations. I read the guideline about additions requiring architectural committee approval, and then I noted, mildly, that I'd been unable to find any approval on file for the large sunroom on the back of the president's own house. And that, while we were reviewing setbacks, the board might want to look at the location of the president's fence. I didn't say it like an accusation. I said it like an auditor reading a finding, which is so much worse because there's nothing to argue with in a number. Carol's gavel hand had stopped moving. Her face had gone a color I'd never seen on her. She tried to interrupt, to rule me out of order, to table the discussion, to seize back control of the room the way she always had. But I had requested these items be on the agenda properly, by the bylaws, and a neighbor 2 rows back, a retired man who'd clearly had his own history with Carol, said quietly but firmly that he'd like to hear the rest, and then someone else agreed. And the room, which had belonged entirely to Carol 10 minutes earlier, quietly stopped being hers. So I turned to the last tab, the financials. And here I was carefulest of all, because this was the one that mattered. I didn't accuse. I simply read what the records showed, that the landscaping contract, a large share of everyone's dues, had gone to the same company for 3 years with no competitive bids. A company that public records showed was owned by the president's brother-in-law. And that there were discrepancies in the reserve account, payments that didn't match approvals, that I thought the membership might want independently reviewed. You have to understand, this wasn't my money being discussed anymore. It was theirs. Every person in that room paid dues. And the moment the conversation turned from the new lady's garden to where did our money go, the temperature of the entire room flipped all at once. 40 people who'd walked in ready to rubber stamp a lien on my house were suddenly looking at the president at the front table and doing math they did not like. I watched it move through the room the way I'd watched numbers move across a page my whole career. A woman near the front pulled out her own dues statements and started doing arithmetic on the back of the agenda. A man by the door asked, out loud, why the contract had never gone out for bids, a simple question, the kind no one had ever dared ask in that room, and the fact that Carol didn't have a clean answer was its own answer. The 2 board members flanking her had gone very still and very quiet, and I watched at least one of them subtly lean away from her, the universal body language of a person deciding, in real time, not to go down with the ship. Carol made one last play. She reached for outrage. How dare I? These were baseless accusations. I was a bitter newcomer attacking a dedicated volunteer who'd given years to this community. For 3 years that tone had worked on this room. It didn't work now because I hadn't made a single accusation. I'd read her own records back to her, and you cannot shout down a document. The harder she pushed, the guiltier she looked, because everyone could see she was attacking the question instead of answering it. At one point, she demanded to know how I'd even gotten all that, and I simply said quietly that her own office had sent it to me, because the law required them to, and that every person in the room had the exact same right to read it. You could feel 40 people privately deciding they would. The lien against my house was not voted that night. What was voted before the meeting ended was a motion, made by the retired man 2 rows back, for an independent review of the association's finances and a full audit of its enforcement practices. It passed almost unanimously. Carol voted against it alone, which told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. I closed my binder. I thanked the board for their time, and I sat back down in my folding chair in the boring fluorescent room where I'd just won a war without raising my voice once. Here is how it landed. In case you need it to land clean, it landed the way an audit always lands once the numbers are finally on the table. Quietly, completely, and without any need for me to say another word. The independent review found everything the records had already told me. The selective enforcement, the president's own unpermitted addition and her non-compliant fence, and the contract steering and the soft reserve fund, which turned out to be exactly what it looked like. Carol Voss did not finish that review as president of anything. She resigned before the membership could remove her, which the small tyrant version of fleeing town, and the matter of the reserve fund went somewhere quieter and more serious than a clubhouse meeting where I'll let it stay. My fines were voided in full, every selectively applied dollar of them. The notion of a lien on my house evaporated because it had never had a leg to stand on. It had only ever had Carol standing on it. The new board, elected by neighbors who'd suddenly remembered the association belonged to them, rewrote the enforcement process so the rules would fall evenly instead of like weather. And the strangest, nicest thing happened in the months after. My neighbors, several of whom had spent that first meeting nodding along to Carol's story about the difficult new lady, started stopping by. To apologize, Some of them to thank me, others because it turned out a lot of them had their own Carol stories, their own selective letters, their own quiet years of being made small, and none of them had ever had the documents to do anything about it. The street felt different after that, lighter. Like a held breath let out. I never raised my voice. I never sued anyone. I never tore out a single plant. I just read the records that were mine to read and asked politely that the rules apply to everyone. I think about that meeting sometimes. Carol at the front table with her gavel, her blazer, and her binder. So certain she was about to take my house over a garden. So certain the quiet woman at the end of the street was the easy one. She spent 3 years assuming no one would ever read the documents. She built her whole little kingdom on that one bet. She just never checked whether the quiet new neighbor read documents for a living. The garden, in case you're wondering, is still there. Bigger now. I had coffee out there this morning, on ground that has never once felt more solid. If you'd have brought the binder too, or if you think she should have just paid the fines and kept her head down, tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been quietly bullied by someone with a rule book and a grudge, you already know exactly how this feels. Subscribe for more stories about the people everyone underestimated, right up until the day someone finally read the records.